Let's talk a little bit about internal family systems for people who aren't aware of what it is. Could you give us a little background on what it is?
Yeah, I don't have the elevator speech quite down, but I can do my best. So, um, many, many years ago, as you said, I was a family therapist, and I thought I'd found the Holy Grail with family therapy. And then I made the mistake of trying to prove that by doing an outcome study at the time with bulimia, and found that we could reorganize the families just the way the book said to do it, and still some of my clients just continued to binge and purge. So I started asking them why, and they started talking about what they called these different parts of them. And they would talk about how there's this critic, and then when the critic attacks me, up comes this part that makes me feel totally worthless. And then that triggers a part that makes me binge to get away from the worthless shame. And then that brings in the critic again, who's attacking me for the binge. And they were caught in those vicious circles inside. And as a family therapist, it sounded familiar, because it was like there were these almost inner people interacting in a way that families did with the vicious circles in the same way. And so I began experimenting. And as I did that, I found that these parts aren't what they seem, that the critic isn't a bundle of critical parental voice, or the binge isn't some out of control impulse, but in fact, they have a lot more to say. And so as I was getting my client to interact with them, as I might in a family, have people interact with each other and ask them questions, they started hearing how these parts were trying to protect them and take care of them, and how they were fighting with each other about how best to do that. And they were also protecting the very vulnerable parts that my clients had locked away because they got hurt. So with all that, I began to really try to get my clients to listen to these parts more instead of fight with them. And in the process of doing that, they would find they didn't want to listen. They were angry at the part, or they were afraid of it. Or like if I were to have you try to work with your critic, and I would have you find it in your body, and most people find it in their head, and I'd ask how you felt toward it, it's likely you'd say, I hate it. It drives me crazy. It makes me feel shitty. So, which is understandable, because it does have that impact. But I would ask you to get that one that hates it so much to relax, so we can just get to know it. And I would do that kind of thing until you got into what now is being called a mindful state relative to it. So you were noticing it, you were curious about it, you wanted to get to know it even. And I'd have you ask it some questions. And in answering those questions, and one question is, ask the part how, what it's afraid would happen if it wasn't so hard on you, for example, if it didn't do this job. In answering that question, usually you'll learn about either a part it protects, which we call an exile, or a part that it's polarized with, that it thinks if it doesn't criticize you, that other one's going to take over. And as you get that, then you have compassion for it, or appreciation for how it's trying to help you. And as you extend that to it, it relaxes more, because it finally feels like you're listening to it. And so on and so on. And again, that's all just parallel to external families. People just really want to be listened to, and they get stuck in these roles because they don't feel like they are. And so the first basic assumption is that we all have parts, and it's not because we've been traumatized. So the mistake many in our culture and our psychotherapies have made is to assume that if you have these parts, it means that you're crazy, because the normal mind is unitary. And that the existence of parts means that that normal unitary mind was blown apart by trauma or something else. So these are little shards of the broken vase, in other words. And my position, after having done this now for over almost 40 years, is that no, it's the natural state of the mind to have parts. And it's actually really good because they all have valuable qualities and resources. But they get forced out of their naturally valuable states by traumas and attachment injuries. And they get frozen in time in the past during the trauma, and they tend to think you're still a little kid they have to protect. And the role they get frozen in often was really necessary at the time to protect you. But they don't know that you grew up and that it's not necessary anymore. So anyway, that's parts. And then it does turn out that as you get parts to separate in open space in the way I described, like the one who hates the critic, asks that one to just step back, that spontaneously you would enter a different state relative to the target part. So instead of hating it, suddenly you'll say spontaneously, without any cueing from me, I'm just kind of curious about it. I want to get to know it. Or even, I feel sorry for it. I want to help it. And as I was doing that in the early days with different clients, I couldn't believe it, because it was like the same person popped out every time and knew how to relate to these parts in a healing way, and came from a place of curiosity and calm and compassion. And we have what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership: curiosity, calm, compassion, confidence, courage, clarity, creativity, and connectedness. I think that's 8.
Yeah, I think you got it.
So this self is in there, and it's covered over by these parts. And as people do the work and separate from their parts more and more, they spontaneously enter the state with a bunch of those C words. And along with those C words is a kind of wisdom about how to relate to parts, and also how to relate to people in the outside world in a healing way. And that self is in everybody. Turns out, again, 40 years later, and thousands of people doing this all over the world, and thousands of clients, maybe millions of clients at this point, we can safely say that self is in everybody and can't be damaged. Because we work with people who've had horrific kinds of childhoods and have the label PTSD, among others. So that's a big deal. That's a very different paradigm for understanding yourself and other people, and that's the model. And then relative to this topic of PTSD, so for us, trauma isn't traumatizing per se. What's traumatizing is the impact it has on your inner system, this inner system of parts and self. And so when people get traumatized, several things happen. One is that the parts of us that are the most sensitive, these lovely inner children that before they were hurt gave us all kinds of great qualities like delight and creativity and awe and all the childhood kind of qualities. But after they get hurt or shamed or terrified, and now they carry those feelings from those experiences, which are what we call burdens. They carry the extreme beliefs and emotions that came from those experiences. Then we don't want anything to do with them, because we think they're just the extreme memories, sensations, and emotions from the trauma. And we want to move on because ours is a rugged individualist culture. And everybody around us tells us to just let it go, just keep going. And so as a result, we tend to lock away those very vulnerable parts of us. So for those parts, it's insult to injury. The injury was the trauma, and then the insult is we abandon them and lock them in a kind of inner basement or abyss and try to forget about them. And as a result, we're cutting off from a lot of those wonderful qualities. We don't have access to them anymore. And these parts are desperate to break out and get us to see what happened and to look back and really get them out of where they're stuck in the past. And so they're trying to break out. And to handle all that, we all have what we call protector parts who are forced out of their naturally valuable states into roles that are protective in an attempt to keep those exiles locked away. And they become, in PTSD, the hypervigilant parts or the hyper-controlling parts, because they're trying to control everything so you don't get triggered again. Or sometimes flashbacks, but dissociating parts that will take you out so that you don't feel anything, or numb your body so you don't feel anything, to try and contain the exiles and protect them. And, so most every symptom of PTSD can be traced to one of these protective parts. And so it's a very different conception it's a different paradigm for understanding all of that. Mm-hmm. And it's a far less pathologizing and a far more empowering paradigm, because there's a lot you can do. You can negotiate with all these parts. And we go to these protectors first because we learned the hard way that if we don't, then they'll backlash on us, they'll attack if we try to go to the exiles without permission. So we go to the protectors, like I would have you, if you had PTSD, focus on that hypervigilant part, and we would have you get to know it as similar to what I was saying about the critic, and honor it for its attempts to protect you, and like you might the military, and then ask what it's afraid would happen if it wasn't so vigilant all the time. And it would talk about how you would be hurt again, because the world is so dangerous that it took that message from the traumas, and it has a responsibility to make sure you don't get hurt again. Mm-hmm. And then we would ask for permission to go to the parts that were still back in those trauma scenes. And often there's a lot of fear about letting us do that. And so then we would negotiate with the hypervigilant part around those fears, and now we know how to address each of those fears and reassure parts about them. Then get permission, then go to the exile, and connect with that younger version of you to the point where it trusts that you care about it, and then ask it what happened when it got hurt. And people will see scenes from the trauma, or feel the emotions, or feel the sensations. And we have a way of keeping them from being overwhelmed while they do that. And then when the part finally feels fully witnessed, sometimes a child, because a lot of these things take us back into childhood, but for some PTSD, we work with combat vets, and so it's a younger soldier that's in combat. I would have you as yourself go into that scene and take that part out of that traumatized time that it's frozen in to a safe, comfortable place, at which point most of these parts are willing to unload the feelings and beliefs they got from the trauma, and then they transform into their naturally valuable states. So this is a model of transformation of PTSD symptoms. It's not like some models where you try to become mindfully aware of them and separate from them, but not really trying to change them. So I just went on and on.
Thank you.
Got me going.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I appreciate that. That's a very comprehensive overview of IFS and how we can apply this to people watching right now who do struggle with PTSD. So